Join me, Phil Stephanie, and Russell Gerber on an interactive show designed to give you more insight and context to all things Africam. On point today, lions. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, as usual, for joining us. Marcel, glad you could make it today. Nice to have you along on a great topic. Today, one of my favorite, and I think one of the biggest icons of the African bush. We thought we would discuss all the details and life structures and everything about lions. But before we do that, how are you doing, Russell?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Phil. It's great to be with you guys out on safari at the moment in the Eastern Cape.
Well, as we like to say, we like to keep moving things forward and adapting and progressing. So we've got Russell remotely. I've got Max on my side here. Folks, as usual, if you've got any questions with regards to lions or, either what we're showing and talking about the show, or if you want to chat about some of the stuff you've... I must say, while putting these pictures and videos together, Russ, I was quite amazed at how many beautiful sightings we get on these cameras. And if you think about it, lions, there's probably about 40,000 lions left worldwide. It's a fairly large number, but it's actually quite an alarming number. They're actually on the vulnerable species list. It's quite nice to have these cameras out all over Africa or South Africa, monitoring these amazing cats, apex predators. It's quite a privilege to be able to still be able to discuss their existence, and let's hope that lasts for a while. So on this show, we're going to talk about everything from the initial stages. By that I mean courting and mating, the whole gestation period, the pride structures, hunting techniques, as well as what do they need to look out for, even though they're at the top of the log. Some of the concerns they might have as lions, because there are quite a few out there. We've seen some injured animals. We often talk about them. There's often a lioness at Tembe. We'll discuss a bit about that. But to start off with, there's a wonderful view of Pride of Lions at Kwa. And we don't often get to see them there, but they're very widely spread throughout all of our cameras, varying pride sizes, which we'll get to at a later stage. Here we find combinations, big adult lioness on the left, and a young male. We'll talk about male lions a bit later. But that one there you can see he's just got a bit of mane starting, which usually starts at about 15 months. And that's when their troubles start. Talking about troubles and the beginning of a circle, if there ever was one. This is a lioness who's busy scent marking and calling. Just have a listen. Got the hardy-da in the background as well. But typically when the courting starts, it often starts with a lioness who comes into estrus. They sexually mature at 24 months. They'll start to call, so that's audio communication, and then scent mark. They'll also do that for territorial reasons, but when a lioness is in estrus, they'll definitely spend a lot more time on their own and calling and scent marking. The male lions will definitely be able to respond to that. They'll call back and very quickly move in to the space, to move into where the lionesses are. When a lioness comes into estrus, it's one of the main aspects of life. Obviously, the concept of breeding. There's a lioness smelling one of the younger cubs. So chemical communication is really important. Those of you that have cats at home, you have something similar. They spend a fair amount of time of smelling each other. Sometimes you see them grimacing. There's two pits on the palate that are scent receptors and take scent to the organ of Jacobson. And so as that lioness that we saw earlier was scent marking, if a male lion arrives while she's in a different area, he'll pick up on that scent and you'll see them grimace sometimes. And those two pits on the palate, they take the scent to the organ of Jacobson and they they decode the message, send it to the back of the brain, which basically deals with emotions. So the male lion can work out if it's a male or female. But in this case, as we're talking about courting, he'll work out quite quickly that it's a female in estrus. And he will also start to call quite a lot, trying to find each other. And it doesn't take that long. Within a night or two, they might find that they find each other. And for the next 2 weeks, maybe 7 to 8 days, they start the process of mating. Here we have two male lions. So there's a dynamic that sometimes comes into it. We'll talk more about the male dynamic, but they almost have their own political system, if you like, within a pride. So those two males had found each other, and there's a lioness. You can see they're very interested in the back end of that lioness. So they're busy understanding the value. Here is another good example. Typically, when there's two males, there's a bit of conflict between the two, but the most dominant of the two or three, or as we'll see later on at Kwa, there's a group of 4 male lions. It's the most dominant male that gets to spend the most of time with a female in estrus. And Russ, I don't know if you want to run us through the concept of pseudo-estrus and working out how the males manage to keep the peace.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, Phil, when you see those males part of the same coalition coming together and male or female in estrus, it can cause a lot of conflict between them. And as you say, the dominant one tends to stay the dominant one and spend the most time with the female and pass on his genes. But the females will often come into that pseudo-estrus, as you mentioned, to almost appease the less dominant males, where she will mate with them and giving them the impression, certainly, that any cubs that she has will be hers as well. And that, of course, stops any potential infanticide, which is something that is practiced by male lions quite commonly when they think that the cubs aren't theirs. But it's a tough life for lion cubs and for the lionesses. You know, we often talk about how things are easy for the males, and we'll come to the males later, as Phil said, but it's also equally difficult for the females, where they have to deal with those different social structures, with the males having different requirements according to their dominance, but at the same time, their primary role is to protect those cubs. So the lionesses will fiercely protect them and use things like you say, Phil, pseudo-estrus, and of course simply just their numbers. There'll normally be more lionesses than male lions, so they'll be able to chase off males within their pride to a certain degree. But for the most part, males who've mated with those females will feel pretty good about letting those cubs grow to adulthood.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting dynamic, especially if you look at this lot here. There's 4 males in this pride. Paul, good afternoon to you. You asked a question here, how many male lions in a pride? And it can vary from one dominant male to a group like this. I've seen 6 in a coalition. And what's really important about that whole pseudo estrus stage is that, if one lioness comes into estrus and this group of 4, if only one had to mate with her, when those cubs arrive, the other 3 would pose a great threat to those cubs. It's a big deal in the world of lions, infanticide, where males that are not fathers, they'll actually take out the offspring that don't belong to them. That brings the lionesses back into estrus and allows them to try again, essentially. So what happens is, let's say this group of 4 males, or even if it's 3, or like we saw earlier, 2 males, when those females come into pseudo-estrus, she'll actually mate with as many of them as she can, if not all of them, so that later on, after their 3 months gestation period, and they start to introduce the pride, or introduce the cubs to the pride, and more importantly, to the existing males, it's really important that they all recall mating with that lioness.
Yeah, Phil, and as you say, it's not always
in an interesting way. Sorry, go ahead, Russ.
No worries. It's not always clear cut. We've had lots of records of males in coalitions like that actually killing cubs regardless of mating with the females. So though the coalitions give them a lot of stability and help them to fight off new males for a long time, it can still happen that the males who didn't spend much time with the female can actually kill the cubs. I don't know if you've seen that before.
Yeah, I think I haven't actually seen. It's also actually quite tricky for us as well to work out. At the moment, as far as I know, it's a concept of recollection of mating, but one can also imagine that that can be quite confusing for them. And I have seen conflict between males and cubs. In fact, one of the most amazing things I've seen is a lioness protecting her cubs, and managed to chase off a male lion who we actually all thought was the father, but he clearly got confused and had other ideas. But that initial stage, so once they've got once they're done with their 3 months gestation period, they typically move off into secluded places, up in the top of the hills around Kwapan, for example, and they hide out for a further maybe month or so before they decide to bring those cubs into the territory, or the natal territory. So this footage we're seeing here, these youngsters are around 6, maybe 7 months old. This is at Tembe. Because while I was watching those pregnant lionesses and trying to find footage of cubs, it became pretty clear that we haven't really seen little cubs. And the reason for that is that they hide them for that first 4 or 5 month period. And then they start to bring them out. And typically they'll move them into the area and they'll start to call a little bit more. The mothers will. They'll slowly try and find their pride. And then, Russ, I'm not sure if you've actually seen the introduction of cubs to the males.
Yeah, I was actually very fortunate, Phil. Last year, just before all the craziness started, I was on a safari in the Kruger and got to actually see that happen with a large pride. It was a pride along the Sabi River. They had about 18 members in the pride, and this lioness was coming back with 4 little cubs, no more than 4 weeks, and introducing them to the males and the rest of the pride. And we were all sitting with bated breath, waiting to see what would happen and how they would react. And if I can tell you, that male lion barely lifted his head up to acknowledge his new children. So not fathers of the year, I would say. But it was an amazing thing to watch. The lionesses were actually far more interested in the new young cubs, but such a cool thing to see.
It's funny you say that. That's exactly the experience that I've had. I've seen it twice. And both times the male lion literally just looked up and said, "Oh, okay, more of you lot." But funny enough, both of those times were just single males. And I'm pretty sure that if there were 3 or 4, that would cause a bit more trouble. But in terms of the survival of the species, it's a really clever program that they have. And once they bring the cubs back and the males are happy with their existence, they then move on with the pride. Lionesses that are on their own with their cubs, often the question is, do they manage to hunt well, and how do they do? They obviously manage to feed themselves fine, but it's not as successful as when they're with their prides. So now these cubs, let's say they're 8 months old, and let's just say, for example, there's 2 males and 2 females, nice and square. Typically, lions will have between 2 and 4 cubs, although I had the privilege of finding a den once, and we found 6. So that got me thinking that they can give birth to more, but they've got 4 teats, and usually by the time anyone gets to see the cubs, I've only ever seen, the most I've seen is 5, and then the one died off quite quickly, landed up with 4. But typically you land up with 2 to 4 that we actually see. But I have seen that they can give birth to more, which is quite an interesting concept on it by itself. But once they get to that sort of safer age, 6 months to 8 months, they start to move with the pride. So we've seen it here at Tembe a lot. There's those 2 youngsters, it's male and female. They're very active. We'll see them shortly chasing all sorts of things from elephants to giraffes. But as the prides start to hunt or start moving, and they start to cover territory or cover ground within their territory, the cubs typically walk along, and as soon as there's a hunting opportunity, they'll often just give a call to their offspring to stay still and let the adults do the hunting. Here are some more footage of lions calling. Some of you might recall this pride on the Olifants River. But for example, on a hunt, if the mothers leave their offspring stashed in a thicket, they often will leave one lioness with them and the others go off on the actual act of hunting. They sometimes might lose contact for a little while, and this is what happened here, I think. As these lions were calling, there were some of the younger ones of the pride, and they were calling to the rest of the pride. And again, that concept of communication, absolutely paramount. But typically at about 6 to 7 months, they'll leave the cubs behind. But as they start to approach 10 months or sub-adulthood, as we call it, I would say, Russell, they become more of a hindrance and an irritation in a hunt.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, Phil, we've seen that a lot, even on the cameras, with some of our highlight videos that we've shown you folks, with a couple of incidences of hunting near the waterhole and the sub-adults being close to the female, how they've totally messed up the hunt. They break cover too soon, they get too excited, and more often than not end up alerting the animal that's being hunted, and that animal alerts the rest of all the animals around in the neighborhood. And as many of you will know, once lions have been spotted and their ambush technique has now been foiled, they really are not that successful in hunting and can't chase down something from a long distance away unless it's a really injured animal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Pete, you say lions were calling at olifants. Just on that note, this is a lioness calling. Let's have a good listen to her. Pete, I'm not sure whether you heard a male lion on the Olifants River, and I hope you're enjoying the Olifants there, Pete. That's for those of you who were on the show 2 shows ago. It's Pete from Africam. He's having a look at the cameras. But yeah, Pete, lions audio for all sorts of reasons. Obviously, if it was a male, I think here you said it was a male, and that'll often be for territorial contact, trying to find pride members. And in that area, Pete, I'm not sure if you've seen any of the lions yet, but there's a great, when the prides are together, there's 27 of them. And that's another dynamic and quite an interesting concept to talk about, is the pride sizes. So in some places, you find that 2 or 3 would be a normal size, especially in areas that are more arid, less things to eat. So whatever they catch, they obviously don't need to share it. But in places like Olifants, for example, or where cat eye are, and having a pride of 27, there's big herds of buffalo, lots of giraffe, and lots of general game, kudu, zebra. So essentially plenty for them to eat. And therefore the pride numbers can grow. But what's also quite interesting to see is that we see these lionesses every now and then roaring. Nice to see that both of them roaring, trying to find each other. Very important from a pridal structure and finding each other. Russ, take a look at this clip here. As a lioness who seems to have a damaged left eye. And that sort of brings me to the next concept or discussion maybe of what lions have to worry about.
Yeah, it's a great point, Phil. It's obviously something that, as rangers and as people who love the bush, when you guys are watching these cameras from home and you see these injured animals, you always feel really bad for them and wonder how they'll survive. Being fit and strong is always such an important thing for wild animals, especially if you're a predator. And for lions, the most common injuries that they tend to get tend to be in the hunting process. So whether it be running at full speed and hitting a hole in the ground that they don't see, injuring their leg or hip or thigh, that can be a major injury for an animal that takes a long time to heal. One of the biggest ones, and possibly what happened to that female, could easily be the horns or the hoof of an animal that they were taking down that happened to catch it just in the wrong place. And there's not much that they can do about that. For the most part, it's just part of the danger of taking prey down. And it can be something as small as an impala that happens to catch them in the wrong place. Of course, these animals will always try and defend themselves as best they can when they're being hunted. But it's always something that they have to be on the lookout for. The other, of course, is other potential predators out there. The lions, as you've mentioned, Phil, are, of course, top of the pops when it comes to our predator hierarchies. But when they're outnumbered by things like hyena, it can be a very dangerous situation for them to be in. But as an adult, as you mentioned, once they get to about a year and beyond, they tend to be okay from the danger of other predators. It's really when they're younger than that other predators can be a danger to the cubs. So you often do hear of stories, and I've been unfortunate enough to see it on a number of occasions where hyenas have found the den of young cubs, or even a leopard finding the den of young cub. But it is certainly something they have to be aware of. This is a great clip, Phil. I'm glad you brought this one in as well. It's another example of something, that can be really dangerous to take down. Now, I mentioned something as small as an impala causing an injury. But of course, a giraffe with a kick to the right spot can actually kill a lion without much effort. And in this instance, of course, taking on something as big as an elephant is really, really risky business. And there are records of lions taking younger elephants down in certain parts of southern Africa, certainly in the Savuti and Cylinder area, I think, Phil. Is that right?
Yeah, I think northern Cylinder, times of extreme drought,
Yeah.
They try all sorts of opportunities when it comes to hunting. And what's interesting to see there, you saw the youngsters playing around with the giraffe and the youngsters playing around with the elephant. The adults are nowhere to be seen. They've had their lessons in life. Although what's interesting here, talking about potential concerns, this is an adult lioness who we've seen playing and testing their luck or more intrigue on these two porcupines. And we've seen this on a couple of occasions. The porcupines have got a very well organized weaponry room there. It keeps them quite safe. But this approach and this attitude that lions have, in fact, I'd say most felines have this curiosity, which does in some cases kill the cat or land up in bad situations. But it does allow them to open up their menu. And it goes from anything from porcupines through to elephants. Russ, you mentioned earlier some of the other things to watch out for. Their biggest arch enemy are the hyenas, which I think we'll do a chat about hyenas at one point. They're fascinating animals, but they're the only ones to manage to deal with the competition of lions. And this is a recent clip and a recent interaction between the two. And here you can see how these hyenas have really gathered together. They've clanned up. I'm not sure what the lions killed in this area. This was probably about a week and a half ago. And it definitely attracted a whole lot of hyena activity. And we see here how they got quite. They're the lions coming from the left there. They got quite a job on their hands. They're chasing it off, trying to assert its dominance. The other youngster coming in there. What again, it's quite interesting. The whole pride wasn't around here, but it is something they need to watch out for. We've often seen wounded lions. There was one at Tembe a while ago with that big wound on her back end. I don't know if you remember that, Russ.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it took her a while to heal up, but she had a big bite on her rump. And so they do need to watch out. And that lioness managed to recover and carry on her lifespan, which usually, by the way, is around 18 months if they don't have any big battles or get taken out by enemies like hyenas or buffalo. And here's an interesting clip of a beautiful male lion. Pete, this is not too far away from where you are right now at Rosie's pan. But you can see this is an older fellow, his hips, bones sticking out there, his spine very clearly visible. And so male lions get a bit of a bad rap within a pride. They actually do have quite an intense life. It's quite a lot shorter, on average 12 years as opposed to lionesses 18 years. Now, this fellow still looks in pretty good condition. But throughout the male's life, so earlier I spoke about having, let's say, 2 lionesses and 2 males in a pride, or in a litter, sorry. The males become breeding threats at 2 years of age. And that's when they actually get moved out of their pridal territory by these dominant males. And they then spend the next 2 or 3 years, depending on the competition in the area, might be longer, but they'll only come into their prime at 5 on average. And they might stay in their prime until about 10, which is where I think this male lion is. He looks to me like he's somewhere around that 9 or 10 year age group. Big scar on his right flank there. I'm sure he's had a couple of battles in his life. But slowly he gets moved out. But those youngsters, young males, there's one there on the far side. You can see he's got a bit of black mane already coming through between his ears. He's going to be quite a formidable threat to the dominant male. And because as he gets to adulthood, he becomes a breeding threat, he gets pushed out. And the point of that is that they stop inbreeding. And as for the next 2 or 3 years, as that male lion moves from one territory to the next, bouncing off prides, getting pushed out, in those 2 or 3 years, the existing dominant males are obviously moving towards the end of their reign. So when these fellows start finding females in estrus and they're about 5 years old, they can now push out the old fellows like the one we just saw. And that starts the whole cycle all over again. So folks, as we come to the end of the show, I hope there's a lot more to talk about on these incredible animals, but I hope it's given you some more insight. Whenever you see the prides and you see males, females, calling and scent marking, there's so much to the dynamics of these incredible predators' lives. It's always nice to bring that to you. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. Russell, I hope your safari goes well.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. It's great to be back out here again. I think things starting to improve worldwide for travel, and I hope we can see you all down here at some point. But in the meantime, as Phil said, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure. And Phil, hope you're okay down there in Cape Town.
Yep. All good. My turn next week.
Indeed.
Folks, have a great day further and keep watching the cameras.